I am delighted to welcome Julie Wyman to channel number 1 of the miniVAte conference. I am so very excited. I saw the title of this slide and read the abstract and can't wait to hear more about Agile lessons from Antarctica. So Julie, take it away.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Robin. And thank you, Stacy, for being the room helpers. Really happy to be here at miniVAte today. So this session focuses on some Agile lessons I picked up along a trip I took a couple of years ago to Antarctica. Now, obviously the Agile Manifesto isn't new, as Ash said in the keynote, and I'm guessing that most people attending today are already bought into the concept of responding to change over following a plan. So the main objective of this session is to highlight how experiences outside of software development can really help us to reinforce this mindset, and perhaps how we can pull lessons and tips from these experiences to increase our empathy for dynamic situations. So just quickly, my name is Julie Wyman. I'm an Agile coach and fellow at Excella. I'm based just outside the DC area in Arlington, Virginia. So hope to be able to start connecting with more people in this Agile Richmond community in the near future. So just to get us started, I'm actually going to ask you guys to join in a Menti poll with me to get a little bit of interaction from you and hear some of your voices. So to get us started with that, right now, I'd like to ask you guys to join a Menti poll that I've created. It's going to allow you to answer some questions and get a little bit of interaction going. So you can do this by joining on your smartphone, or you can just do it in your browser, whichever is easiest for you. But you can go to www.menti.com. It's right up here on the screen, and then it'll just ask you to enter a code. So the code for my poll will be 75760580. Or you can, if it works easiest for you, you can scan the QR code that's just up here on the screen. Or if neither of those work, Robin is going to drop in this direct link. It's also on the screen here, but she'll drop the direct link into the Zoom chat, and you can also take that and just put that directly into your browser. In any event, if you can use one of these methods and go to the Menti, it will pop up a question for you. And I'd like you to just take a moment to ponder it and submit your answers so that we can start thinking about some of these concepts that we're going to look through today. So when you do that, again, going to www.menti.com and entering the code 75760580, then this is the first question that you should see. What emotions or adjectives come to mind when you think about change? And you can enter multiple things, a couple of responses, and you see them popping up on the screen. So we'll just give a little bit of time to make sure that everyone has a chance to respond. We've only got about 7 people responding so far, so we'll give a moment. This code is on this screen as well, so it's still up here at the top, menti.com, and the code is up here at the top as well. So I'm going to give it a moment to keep seeing more responses coming in. So again, just what's your first gut feel when you hear the word change? What emotions or adjectives come to mind? Seeing a mix, seeing 2 big ones in the middle, exciting, but also exhausting. Resistance, hard, anxiety, interesting, uncomfortable, fear, interested, adapting, curious. So this whole mix of things that are excitement, but also exhausting, resistance and fear, but necessary, adapting, welcomed, but defensiveness, optimism, but uncomfortable. This whole mix of all these different concepts and emotions that the concept of change brings up. This has been my experience as well. All right, I'm going to ask you to do one more here. So I'm going to advance the slide. And you should see that the poll will give you an opportunity to refresh, or if you need, you can just manually refresh on your screen. So now go ahead and answer the same question, but think about what comes to mind when you consider planning. Okay, so seeing some more come in. Big one, necessary in the middle. It's kind of overwhelming right now. Important, organization, structure, time consuming, challenging, focus, intentional, helpful, also exhausting, prepared, time consuming, organization, helpful, challenging, transparency, roadmap, difficult, valuable, structure. Yeah, a whole mix, right? Some definite necessity, but it doesn't mean that it's always the easiest thing to accomplish. So thank you guys for participating in that. We are going to come back to the Menti a little bit later in the talk. So keep that if you have it logged in. But I am going to pop back to the deck for the moment. So there are definitely no shortage of quotes about the need for planning and the constancy of change. I think it's a common misconception that there is no need to plan in Agile, that it's just all about go with the flow. But of course, that's not the case. And in fact, we know that there's guidance directly in the Agile manifesto itself. We know that right here we have built in the concept of responding to change over following a plan. What always strikes me is that too often people forget this last line, which highlights the necessity for both items, but in the right amounts and in the right way. And it actually doesn't say anything about not making a plan. It just says not to continue to follow one when circumstances have changed. And that need to balance both planning and responding to change really resonates with me. There's a large amount of my personality that enjoys making a good plan and is ready to march out and check off those items from my list. But through many, many life experiences, I've also come to appreciate that no planning is perfect enough to prevent you from taking a good face plant every once in a while. And that on those occasions, you just have to adjust and find a new way forward. So, although I know it's still necessary to plan in Agile environments, I think that the specific approaches to planning do change from a more big upfront design to a just enough approach. And with just enough, we're planning in much more detail for the smaller time horizons, and we're not trying to get very specific for items that are further out. And I think this right amount of planning has great value. I think collaborative planning can really spur discussions that lead to new discoveries. It can improve understanding across a team. It can provide a much clearer sense of the true goal. What resonates with me really strongly is this idea of commander's intent. Commander's intent is the definition and description of what a successful operation will yield. So a good commander's intent will allow employees and a team to adapt the actual plan using improvisation, initiative, and adaptation to reach the plan's original objective. So how they get there can change, but they know what they're driving towards. So I think in most Agile environments, we accept that many things will change and we'll need to remain flexible about how we respond to them. But if we planned well, we can go into these changes with a clear sense of our goal and how we can still achieve it under the new circumstances. When I think about some work examples for this, I think about us setting our release goals. We know and acknowledge that the exact actual features that we deliver, the exact user stories, and certainly the exact acceptance criteria underneath them may change along the way, but this release goal still provides us some good guiding focus. And certainly we know that a product owner defining the what is the key, and that it leaves the team a lot of flexibility in adjusting the how of how they're going to achieve that what that the product owner defines. So this idea of keeping the goal in mind, but adapting the approach, I think is pretty widespread, but nowhere is this more true than in Antarctica. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about both planning and change in the context of Antarctica, but along the way, I'm going to call out some of my key takeaways about both. So I'll start with planning. Our expedition leader, when we started off on this cruise, started by telling everybody on board all the reasons that her team would spend a lot of time conducting very detailed planning. One was to minimize emergencies due to our highly remote location. Another reason was that there were quite a number of environmental regulations that they had to follow. And ultimately, the most important was passenger safety and experience. So Antarctica is literally the end of the earth, right? And so we are quite remote. There is no running to the doctor, running to urgent care. You are very far. And even though this map shows, a dotted line that a plane could maybe come to get you, there's no guarantee that a plane is going to quickly be able to make that journey or that you can get it anytime you need it. So it's very, very important to minimize any medical emergencies. And so a lot of planning goes into trying to make sure that you're as safe as possible due to the highly remote nature. There's a lot of planning also that went into it due to environmental protection that I hadn't been aware of until I got there. So in these animals that live in Antarctica, it's their home. And so there's a lot that goes into protecting them. You want to stay on the paths so that you don't mess up their habitat. This picture on the left is actually of what they call penguin highways. So these trails that penguins actually make to make their little routes to go up and down to where they need to go. And you don't want to mess up these paths that they've created for themselves. Similarly, when we do create some holes by where we walk, you need to fill them in as you walk so that they don't fall into them and get stuck. You also want to keep your distance. So there's a lot of rules about how close you can get to the animals and how you have to stay away. And finally, one thing that was interesting is every time we left the boat, we actually had to sanitize our boots before we even stepped onto Antarctica so that we weren't introducing any new organisms into that habitat. So a lot of planning to try to protect that environment. But again, passenger safety was at the top of the list because planning is really important when you're about to take a whole bunch of passengers out to explore. So this picture here is a portal point. It was our first continental landing during the trip. It was very exciting because we were finally going to touch ground on Antarctica, but it's really critical because this beautiful pristine snow is not just covering rolling hills, it's also covering really deep crevices that you could easily fall in if you stepped in just the wrong place. So the mountain guides have to go out ahead of everyone to lay a trail, and you really precisely have to stick to that. And as someone who stepped not more, I'm promising you, than 1 foot off the trail, just to pause to take a photo and let someone pass behind me, I quickly ended up thigh deep in snow and definitely learned my lesson to stay exactly on the trip. And that safety extends to making sure that you can really enjoy the full experience. Safety is all about how close you can get to these glaciers and any snow drifts. It's all about how you get in and out of these little zodiacs, these little rafts that you use to go ahead and be on the water and see the ice. Because again, one slip of them, if you twist an ankle, if you break a leg, it's not so easy to get that medical attention. So safety is all part of the experience, but it really also is about having the best possible experience and getting to maximize everything that you can see and all the enjoyment that goes into it. So every day, the expedition team spent lots of time planning our excursions. They would put together these daily itineraries for us, and there were a lot of factors to coordinate to make sure that everything went smoothly. You have 100+ passengers that are all trying to get off a ship at the same time. That's not going to work very well. So instead, they divided us up into these 6 different disembarkation groups so that we would come down in smaller groups, and they had sign-in, sign-out sheets so that they could really track where everybody was. So they had a really good orderly system for this whole process. And again, since there's no running to the nearest store, if you forget anything, you needed to make sure that you brought all the right gear with you for the environment, and planning was a critical element of that. So here also, the right level of planning ahead with your clothing choices could really make it easier to respond to the changing weather conditions. But you could not bring any extra stuff. And this is where, if you think, okay, well, I'll just bring everything, then I'll be covered. You can't do that. The planes that we took to get to Antarctica were only about half each, and our luggage had to be weighed exactly to the pound. So the pilots knew exactly what the weights were, because what they would roughly call a runway, which was gravel where we were landing, was very short, and they wanted to make sure that the planes didn't run off of them. So it was very precise. And there was a lot of planning to make sure that you had exactly what you needed, but nothing more. So it was really important to make sure you had the right gear. So these are just some examples of us all geared up and ready to go. But my aunt here is wearing one of these yellow jackets that they actually gave us. And these jackets were interestingly designed to anticipate exactly the changing temperatures that we were known to expect. And so you might think it's funny that you might actually get so hot in Antarctica that you would want to take off your jacket. But we were there, in fact, in their summer, and on a nice day with the sun out, trekking around, exploring, you could get quite warm. So you might want to zip it off and get some fresh air. And they actually built these jackets so that you could flip them inside out, and they actually had straps on the inside, and you could put them on and then wear it as a backpack. So it wouldn't be on you, but you would be carrying it around with you, so that instead of putting it on the ground, you would take it with you. And the reason they didn't want you to put it on the ground is because if you did that, it would be very likely that you would get penguin poop all over your jacket, which would then later stink up your cabin. So again, just a lot of designing going into anticipating what you might want to respond to in the particular environment. So this brings me to my first two takeaways from the trip. The first one being planning is absolutely still necessary. And the right planning actually makes it easier to later be able to respond to change. So let's talk a little bit more about responding to change in Antarctica. On our first briefing aboard our ship, it was all about expectation setting. Our expedition leader let us know all about the process that she would use to make decisions and how she would keep us informed when things changed. She also tried to prepare us for the fact that things absolutely would change, and very frequently. She said there are many reasons why our plans would change when you're in Antarctica. There are forces outside of our control, like weather, fog, wave surges, near hurricane force winds, and there's also newly discovered information, things like new animal sightings, military exercises occurring nearby, and all of these could warrant a change. So most of the adjustments would just involve the specifics of how we were going to accomplish one of our goals, but not a wholesale change to the goals themselves. Because clearly, these different conditions will allow for different opportunities and could necessitate a change in the day's plans. It could be perfectly sunny and crystal calm, or it could be a little bit bumpy and snowy. And these were all within 1 week. Sometimes day to day, sometimes within the same day. So again, this is one of those daily plans that I shared with you before. And you can see that there are some clues baked right into this plan about how things may change. So this is that plan from that first day when we wanted to land at Portal Point. And it actually says, we hope to land at Portal Point. This will be our first attempt at a continental landing. We aim to Zodiac cruise. We hope, right? So all of this is expectation setting, making it really clear and upfront continuously to help ensure that everyone was on the same page and prepared for the fact that some change might occur. They did a really good job with contingency planning and having different options in the face of change. And this definitely got me thinking that it's something I can do better in some of my work settings. So while they had plans in place based on all their previous experience, they often had to verify that they still made sense. So they would send a mountain guide out to test the route and adjust it if necessary. And they couldn't necessarily rely even on the same routes that they had used just the last week. So we often ended up having to take routes that weren't the most direct because they had to find the safest path given the current environment and the most up-to-date information. So with all of those thoughts about change in mind, my third trip takeaway was to set expectations early and often. That was really important to how we took in and experienced those elements of change. And as a 2021 life example, this takeaway really makes me think a lot about the communications that my company has been providing lately about potential return to work options. communicating frequently with us and well in advance of any potential changes. Well, let me just walk you through one example of just a single ever-changing day in Antarctica. So like I said, we typically had one daily goal. And on this particular day, our goal was to see a colony of Gen 2 penguins. So we're gonna mix it up a little, and we're gonna do a pop quiz to find out who knows their penguins. So go ahead and jump back into the Menti. It's gonna be the exact same code. So if you're still in it, you should be able to just refresh once I update it. But if you need to rejoin, it'll be the same code. So menti.com and then 75760580. And I want to ask you, which one of these 3 penguins do you think is the Gen 2 penguin? So we're going to go ahead and guess. I'll just give you a moment to join. Because Agile is important, but so are penguins. So got to make sure you leave with at least some good penguin knowledge today. All right, let's see what we're getting. So this is it's just scaling the image. This is not, the B is not the answer. It's just cropping the image when I go to look at the results. So it's not a clue. Although clearly you guys think it is B. Okay, I'm gonna pop back and we will reveal the official answer. Okay, well, the answer is, it's actually A. So A is the Gen 2 penguin. It's the one with the orange beak. B is actually the chin strap penguin. It has this nice little black strap right along the chin. So that's actually the chin strap. And then the Adelie penguin is the one with an entirely black face and black beak. So just a little penguin knowledge for you to take along with you today. But again, on this particular day, our goal was to find a colony of Gen 2 penguins. So the night before, our expedition team briefed us on their carefully prepared plan. It was based on all of their knowledge of the best viewing spots in the area. It took into account the expected weather conditions. We'll call that Plan A. Plan A only lasted until Plan B was announced during the morning wake-up call. We were a little behind schedule, so disembarkation times were pushed by half an hour. Then as we were eating breakfast, Plan C rolled right in. It was our first choice landing spot, or our first choice landing spot wasn't going to work because the wave surge was too high. So it was going to be too dangerous to try to land on those zodiacs when you then had to jump out and get into and walk onto the shore. So we were going to go instead, try to go around the corner of the peninsula and try to land there instead. So that brings me to my 4th trip takeaway, which is to try to keep the goal in mind, but adapt the approach that you take to get there as needed. So we did that. We just kept that goal, find the Gen 2s, adapted the approach, went around the corner of the peninsula, and success, we found the Gen 2s. This nice large colony of Gen 2 penguins situated amongst this beautiful water and ice. So I got to see lots of penguins waddling around, which I guess I had expected, but of course it is very cute to see penguins waddling. Who doesn't like that? And then I also learned, which was a little bit more surprising to me as I hadn't seen it before, that sometimes penguins travel this way. A little bit of an easier shortcut of a way to roll down a hill. So this was all part of our plan to see the penguins. And then we actually had a little bit of a plan for after the penguins to go for a quick little Zodiac cruise, which was sometimes what we did afterwards to just see, be on the water and see some of the ice. So we started to do that and we were almost done with our Zodiac cruise. It was just about time for us to be heading back to the ship when all of a sudden off in the distance, someone spotted a whale tail. And so we went ahead and we seized that opportunity and we embarked on an unplanned Plan D, which was an extended Zodiac cruise to go ahead and try to get closer and check out those whales up close. So in this case, extending our cruise ended up being a bonus. We were able to do both things. But in other circumstances, it could have meant not landing where we intended and entirely forgoing a planned landing activity so that we could go see the whales instead, which may have been worth it in order to be able to seize that new unforeseen opportunity. So in most of my work situations, I'm mostly tweaking and adjusting my plans, but occasionally it does make sense to entirely shift, like when there's a drastic change in timelines or in a market. There is another well-known and noteworthy Antarctic example of having to respond to change, and that is Ernest Shackleton's voyage on the vessel Endurance. So he set out with this crew. It's an amazing story with an original goal of wanting to cut across the Antarctic continent. They wanted to start from the side of the Weddell Sea and cross the whole continent. So turn by turn, as events unfolded, Shackleton had to respond to change and adapt his plans and tactics. So they were going along and their ship got stuck in a bunch of ice. But initially, he thought that they could just wait it out. That has happened sometimes, and eventually the ice will break up on its own. So he thought they could just adjust their timeline a bit, float with the ice, it would carry them, and then they would wait for the ice to break up, and then they would keep going on their way. However, and they were going to keep their initial goal in mind. But at some point, it became clear that the ship would not get unstuck from the ice. In fact, the ice actually cracked the hull of the ship and broke it, which is what you're seeing here in this photo. And so at that point, their entire goal had to change into just the survival of the crew. So through continuous adaptation, Shackleton had to devise a new plan. And to meet this new goal, it required multiple trips and a lot of attempts to come back and get the crew, but they were eventually able to rescue every single person, which was by then a much more important accomplishment than their initial goal. So it is quite the remarkable story. And that is the fifth trip takeaway, which is that when circumstances truly necessitate it, change your actual goal. And I will share the very first time that I gave this talk was back in February of 2020. And at that point, this fifth takeaway seemed relevant, but it didn't seem quite as common as the others. Well, since then, obviously a global pandemic has provided many examples of this one, so it serves to me as a good reminder to not steadfastly stick to plans that just don't make sense anymore. And my sixth and final takeaway, the one that's actually the most important and has stuck with me, resonated the most, is about empathy. One of my ultimate key takeaways was an increased sense of empathy for team members who are struggling with dynamic situations. Even though regular replanning became a normal part of being in Antarctica, we often had plans A through D, sometimes E, F, and G in a single day. It doesn't mean it was a natural fit for every passenger's personality. And observing their difficulties and experiencing my own gave me more empathy for members of my own team who are struggling with changing plans. So I'll share just one story about that in particular. This is a photo from January 7th when we were scheduled to leave Antarctica and take our flight back to Chile. We tried to leave all day. We spent the day mostly hanging out in this room since they were starting to clean our cabins and turn them over for the next set of passengers. Multiple times this day, we tried to get dressed and trek down to leave, only to get called back at the last minute. But none of this was atypical. The weather varies a lot in Antarctica, and it often takes a while to get a good weather window. So this was all par for the course. But finally, we thought we got the call to disembark. So we were heading down the stairs as part of our disembarkation group, and we took our goodbye selfie. Well, we made it all the way to the landing spot for the plane, only to hear that the plane had actually had to turn back mid-flight because it wouldn't be able to land because this set of clouds in this photo had rolled in. So there was no visibility for the plane to land. So although the plane had taken off with a good plan and the best info available, it also had to respond to change as the weather unfolded for the safety of all those involved. So it was back to that club room all the next day, and we spent the day in the waiting game, but spirits were relatively high at first. But we didn't take off the next day either, and it wasn't so hard to see why. You looked out your window and fog was all you could see as far as you could see. Luckily, we had supplies enough and we weren't in any danger ourselves. And we were getting a lot of empathy at that time for the passengers on the trip that was supposed to be after ours, as we learned that their whole trip had been canceled since there wouldn't be enough time by the time we left for them to come on their trip. And we knew that, like us, they had probably scheduled their trip well over a year in advance, and now they wouldn't be able to go at all. So no big deal for us. We just had to wait a couple extra days to leave. So we were feeling extra empathetic for them. But then those clouds hung around day after day after day. And even though our plans had to keep changing due to safety, it didn't mean it was easy. I personally started to get more anxious as they started to talk about how we might have to sail back on the ship instead of flying back as planned. This anxiety felt real to me, as I had specifically selected this fly trip based on serious motion sickness issues that I had experienced in the past. So it really made me think about the fact that as I roll out changes in my work environment, even ones that I know are logical and we absolutely need, it doesn't mean that they're not still hard for people to expect or to accept. And this experience has helped ground me in remembering to give people the space that they need to process that information. But after a couple more days, finally, it seemed to us at least like the weather had changed, and surely now we would be able to get out. But it still wasn't up to us, and there were a lot of other factors involved. Yes, the fog had lifted, but it had also gotten colder, potentially making the runway more icy. And this decision of whether we could fly or not was just not within our expeditions team's control. But the decision of whether to sail or not was, and we just could not indefinitely stick it out, waiting and holding fast to our original plan. So, and the reason was that some people were starting to run out of critical medications. People were expected back at work and for other events. The ship was eventually needed for its next trip, and at some point we would eventually run out of supplies. So the expedition team set expectations with us that if we couldn't leave by midnight of the next day, we would instead start sailing back to Argentina instead of flying back to Chile as planned. So even in this situation, which would have been a wholesale change to our original plan, they managed it the very best they could, meeting ahead of time with every concerned passenger to let them know what they were thinking and to let them know that they could talk to the ship's captain and the doctor about any concerns they had and the best options available to them. So remember, we were supposed to depart on January 7th, and instead we hung around and took lots more excursions, but we did finally make it out on January 13th, literally at 11:30 p.m., just in time to avoid having to sail all the way back. So in this context of Antarctica, the planning and all the replanning didn't feel like wasted effort and rework. It did feel like just a necessary fact of the environment that we were in. But in reality, when I reflect, I feel like in my work situations, they're also just changing rapidly for different reasons. And so I need to come to expect and prepare for that responding to change on a regular basis. And this experience has helped me in reframing so that when I do respond to that change at work, it isn't seen as a failure in the planning process. So spending those 6 extra days in Antarctica with no control over how long it lasted really helped me leave with more empathy for when people are struggling to adapt to those changes, because ultimately it is people who are experiencing change, and we need to remember that. And what we can focus on are the things that we can control, like the communication and the expectation setting, because they do make a tremendous amount of difference to how people process and experience that change. beyond the factors that we can't control. So that was my sixth and final trip takeaway, which is to keep empathy at the forefront. So those are my 6 key Agile and change related takeaways that a trip somewhere even as far away as Antarctica inspired. And with a little bit of the time that we have left, I'd like to encourage each of you to reflect on some of your own non-development or directly work-related experiences and how they too may be able to bring in some connections that do in fact tie back to what your teams are going through. So please take a moment and consider these 3 questions that I've posed here. First, try to think of a non-software or development example that you can use to help relate to challenges your teams face. Then think about what lessons you may have already drawn on about how people respond to change in other scenarios. And finally, since we've all been through quite a lot in the last year, what has the last year taught you about responding to change and about the importance of empathy? And if you feel comfortable sharing, it's okay if you don't, but I hope that many of you will. If you do feel comfortable sharing, please pop back into the Menti, the same one that we've been using this whole time, and add your responses to any or all of these questions. You'll be able to submit multiple responses, so you can type an answer and then you can just type another one for a different question if you'd like. So please go ahead and just take a couple moments, and then I'll pop back to the Menti and we can see what people are thinking. So again, that's the same Menti. It's www.menti.com. The code 75760580.
And the link is in the chat, folks.
Yeah, and then there's a direct link if that's easier. And you can answer one of the questions, or you can answer multiple, anything that pops to mind.
Hey, Julie.
Yeah.
Hi, good morning. This is Alok. I loved your presentation, and I wanted to share regarding responding to change, one of the questions that you had up there.
Sure.
Not the non-dev example, right?
Yeah.
So my wife's my father-in-law essentially was diagnosed um, with lung cancer, and we were not in a good visa situation to have my wife go visit him. COVID, of course, all part of the consideration. But when we realized that my wife was able to get the shots in time, and also that her visa situation could be addressed in a different way, we did that. We changed the plans, and instead of waiting until June, she was able to visit him in March. And she was able to, of course, get out before all the huge surge that's happening in India. So it was definitely something that worked out really well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very hard. Thank you for sharing that personal example. Yeah, it is hard when facing these challenges, and sometimes you're able to find different solutions and paths that do emerge different than the path that you thought initially was the only option for you. So thank you very much for sharing that.
Of course.
Yeah, seeing some other responses pop in here. seeing some lessons about allowing others space, dealing about, having to deal through bad weather during a trip, planning a wedding during times of COVID. That is definitely an example that I would think would be full of challenges that could be related to neurodivergence, affects how people relate from working from home, considering the perspective of others when dealing with change. Yes, planning events for a local club. Things can change fast based on availability and weather. Of course, trying to adapt to change quickly, that what's not right for me, that what is right for me may not be right for someone else. Yes, I think everyone has had a lot of experiences with different rules and changing rules, waiting in lines, frustration, immediate frustration, and learning to give empathy to others. The effects of COVID, the certain urgency of working from home, virtual learning at the same time, empathy for everyone going through it and needing human contact, and the teachers trying to respond to remote schooling with no warning, not everyone having the same access, empathy for the kids who don't have support and resources. Yeah, there's a lot that's been going on. And while these are not work-related examples, the empathy that we feel and the examples that we can take from them, may be things that we can still bring into our interactions at work, showing my home team, my children, empathy through their struggles in school. So that's the thing, is there's a lot that we're going through, and the parallels really can, I think, cut across in many ways. So thank you to everyone who took the time to share some of those examples. And for those of you that reflected, I hope you found some examples as well. I'm just going to recap now. So again, I went through kind of my six key takeaways. This is just a little visual representation of all of them together. A sketch note that was created by one of my colleagues, Joe Morrison. So just in visual format of those 6 takeaways. But ultimately, what I came away from the trip feeling that it emphasized was that we really need planning, but even more importantly, the ability to respond to change. And it was the expedition team's ability to set clear goals, set expectations, while adjusting to new circumstances, that protected me and all the other passengers from negative outcomes, and at the same time really maximized our positive experiences, like being able to see baby penguins, beautiful ice sculptures, lots of penguins on the ice sculptures, humongous colonies, tens of thousands of those chinstrap penguins, Weddell seals, leopard seals, and of course, those beautiful humpback whales, nice and up close. So this is my contact info. I am happy to stay in touch and connect with anyone after this. My email's right there. I'm not on most of the social media platforms, but I am on LinkedIn. So that is the best way to follow and stay in touch with me. And I have a couple of blogs as well. So I'm very happy to connect and stay in touch. And with that, I have the remaining amount of time for anybody that has questions. And thank you all for joining today.
Hey, thank you. Big round of applause to you, Julie. Thanks a lot. I just want to say one comment, Julie. This really reminds me of something I just wrote recently, and Robin knows that. Like, I used my Disney trip example to explain Scrum to kids. And like, when you plan your trip, you need planning, but then if rain happened in the trip or something else happened, you have to change your plans accordingly. Like weather can change, things can happen. So I can really relate to this, and that's why I joined the session to see like how you really have to plan that trip, but then you have to be agile. You have to be able to respond to change when things do happen wrong in the trip. It can happen. Rain can happen. You can't predict that. There could be some things can happen. You might get sick as well. You never know what could happen. So this is a really good example, and great. So I think that's what I feel like. Anything we do, planning a trip, planning a wedding, whatever you guys do, it's all relates to agile somehow, somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, those manifesto principles are pretty universal. Really that mindset that you can take in. Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Julie, thank you so much for an incredible presentation. I feel as though I partially joined you there without all of the cold and wet and so forth, but thank you so much for exposing us to something new and for taking us down this avenue. I really appreciate it. Folks, if you have any additional questions, we have until 10:55, and then we'll start prepping for our next session. If you would like to stay for the next session on this channel, please just hang in there right here. Otherwise, channels 2 and 3 are also open. And you can refer back to innovatevirginia.com for a schedule of our sessions. 11 o'clock, we have Craig Strong on this session, Discovering Kanban, Human-Centered Design and Kanban Flight Levels. Cameron Hall on channel 2, how we launched an app in the middle of COVID, and Debbie Levitt, improving agility by using customers' definitions of quality and done. But back to Julie, and if there are any additional questions, please bring them.
Well, thank you, Robin and Stacy. Appreciate everything that you guys are doing to help pull together and support this event. It's really nice to be able to engage back with the community again. So thank you both.
It was a delight to have you. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone.
All right.